white background will blend in. Good morning, friends. It's good to be here again. It seems like I was just here yesterday, so time flies when you're having fun. So the reading this morning is from Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. God has sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and release to the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's gracious mercy. When I was sitting and discerning the message for today, I kept hearing the word Jubilee. And this is one of the verses in the Hebrew scriptures that sets up the idea of Jubilee, which was every 50th year, debts were forgiven, Israelite slaves were freed, not all of them, and land was returned to a proper owner, debts were forgiven. And so I thought of Jubilee also is another word for Juneteenth. It's kind of synonymous with that. And I decided that I didn't want to grasp a hold of Father's Day and Jubilee or summer solstice and Jubilee, but Juneteenth and Jubilee. And I realized I didn't really know any backstory to what Juneteenth was, other than, yay, the slaves in Texas were freed. It's not that simple. And I couldn't recall any of my U.S. history from 800 years ago, so I decided to do some research. And it turns out that emancipation, and I feel like I should say emancipation, came at different times to various places in the un-United States or the dis-United States, starting with the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, I had this image that the Emancipation Proclamation was kind of a magic wand that, you're all free. But Abraham Lincoln gave it in September of 1862. It was actually to be in effect January 1st of 1863. And that's where the African American tradition adopted the first watch tradition of the Moravians, because on December 31st, they stayed up and waited until midnight to celebrate freedom, because that was when the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. They stayed up all night until the sun rose. But the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery in the United States. It only applied to the 11 Confederate states that were fighting against the Union, and only to the portion of those states that were not already occupied by Union soldiers. And this was one thing I learned that I don't think I ever knew, was that it didn't apply to the Union states that bordered the Confederacy. There were 5 states that were slaveholding states in the Union. Didn't apply to them. So what really ended up is that if a slave could make it to a free state or to a Union-occupied territory, area, region, city, they were deemed free. And that freedom came instead of being returned to the slave owner, which was the way it was before. So it turns out that as the Union troops advanced, so did freedom. Emancipation happened time and time and time again as the troops began to spread. Well, after that came the 13th Amendment. That's the one that makes slavery and involuntary service illegal. It was passed in Congress 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. 2 years. And if that was January 31st of 1865, and if you know your history well enough, I didn't know. The Civil War was still raging, and it would be another 2.5 months, April 9th, 1865, that the forces surrendered and the Confederacy was done. And less than a week from after that, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. So I was kind of lining up my ducks, to understand emancipation. But so far as the state of Texas goes, it was considerably isolated. They had had a mass immigration from other states, migration maybe, from other states, because they could hold slaves there. And was under martial law. The Union troops couldn't contain them very well because it was such an isolated state. And freedom had been declared on multiple occasions. But the challenge was, how do you enforce the Emancipation Proclamation in such a sprawling state? And so on June 19th, that was the final nail in the coffin, if you will, of Texas, when a general came into Galveston and declared once and for all the Emancipation Proclamation applies to Texas. Surprisingly, it wasn't till 6 months after Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865, that the 13th Amendment was fully ratified and adopted as a constitutional amendment. So, if it's not, maybe the main thing that my research showed me is that freedom that we celebrate on Juneteenth was actually a complex and complicated unfolding over a period of 36 months. And the varied ways that 4 million slaves who were liberated took up freedom was equally as complex and complicated. There were people who decided to stay put right where they were and continue working for the people who enslaved them because that felt safe to them. I heard a recording of a man from the 40s who told the story of this young woman who the Union soldiers had taken over wherever he was, and the Union soldiers stopped. They were on horseback and said, "Do you want to come with us?" And he was too afraid. He was too afraid of his own freedom. But a young adult slave woman said, "Oh yeah, I'm out of here." And she jumped on the back of the horse with the Union soldier, and they never saw her again because she went to find her freedom. I think the truth is that freedom is as much a state of mind, more so than anything else. And that doesn't solely apply to freed slaves. In his book, A Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl, who is an Austrian psychiatrist and a Holocaust survivor, wrote these words: "We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts, comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one. The last human freedom is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way of being. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom." And you have to imagine this was from a man who saw such dire circumstances and could still claim a level of freedom. So in no way do I want to minimize or dismiss the horrific experience of being enslaved or human trafficking or war. But at the same time, I believe Frankel's pinpoints what true freedom is about. Freedom is connected to the part of us that cannot be chained, handcuffed, or jailed. Throughout my research, I encountered stories of slaves who stayed connected to their power to choose. There was a story of a woman who claimed just a small plot of dirt near the cabins where all of the slaves stayed. She would lay on that plot of dirt and feel the warmth of the earth beneath her. And she would look up at the stars at night. She would dream of what life might be like if and when she was free. Having been born into slavery in America, she really had no idea of what freedom looked like. But she held on to the possibility. Tilly Horn Schultz, a young East German girl, spent her youth hiding not only from Hitler's troops, but from the Russian soldiers who invaded East Germany after World War II. She held on to the knowledge, despite her eventual abuse at the hands of the Russian soldiers. She clung to the knowledge that people were living free in America. In her biography, Tilly's story, My Thoughts Are Free, she tells of holding on to the dream of freedom and the belief that no one could imprison her thoughts. Mahatma Gandhi once said, "You can chain me, you can torture me, you can even destroy my body, but you will never imprison my mind." So I have a funny little story in all this seriousness to share with you. I was sharing over lunch on Wednesday with a fellow counselor about the results of my research. And she said, "You know, these stories remind me of the flea circus my great uncle used to have." I always thought those were fictional, but he said, she's like, "Fleas? How, what?" And he showed her that training fleas is really easy. What he would do is put them in a jar for 3 days and, close the lid on the jar. But after 3 days, he could open the lid and they would not go anywhere. They wouldn't try to jump out because they had, for 3 days, been jumping up and hitting their heads on the lid, and then they gave up. And so in that way, to me, it's like that's the mindset of freedom or no freedom, is we get so conditioned. Humans do the same thing, really. Modern day Buddhist monk Stephen Gray puts it this way: why is it that so few people are free? Because they try to conform to ideas, concepts, and beliefs in their heads. We become so habituated to limited thoughts and limiting beliefs that we don't even try to break the bonds of our lives. Among the stories of the American slaves who risked everything for freedom, and there are those who found ways to be free in their minds when they were enslaved. As Toni Morrison said about them, freeing yourself was one thing. Claiming ownership to that freedom was another thing. Well, you know me. Most of you know me. I'm not going to leave you with a history lesson. As we honor and celebrate Juneteenth, I keep finding myself wondering, what is it that enslaves me? Probably my worst habit that enslaves me is the habit of sitting. I sit too much. My work entails sitting, my play entails sitting, and it's like, this really enslaves me. What habits, what beliefs or traditions or ideas limit you? How have you been conditioned? I used to tell Tracy when we moved into our awesome house that we live in now, I have a 1960s bathroom. And it's like, I want to get stuff fixed before I grow so accustomed to it, I can't see it. So I get limited by my conditioning. While working as a hospice chaplain, I met weekly with this elder couple who lived off a dirt road in the middle of somewhere, Alamance County. And they were literally all alone. Their church had just kind of written them off because they were stuck at home. They had no children, and all of their siblings were gone, so they were alone. And the wife had become, Miss Sarah, had become her husband's sole caregiver. And she shared with me outside, out of his hearing, how depressed she had become because he just could sit on the couch and he couldn't move without her help. And he would just sit hour after hour after hour watching CSI reruns. And y'all know there are a lot of CSI episodes, from New York to Miami to wherever. And she was depressed. She was beginning to resent her husband and her now very limited role. But when I asked her, I said, what are the things you used to love to do before John got so sick that you had to become his caregiver, 24/7 caregiver? She shared with me her love for writing poetry and creating watercolor painting. She'd been so conditioned by their situation that she lost the ability to see that she could choose something differently, even though she couldn't change her situation with her husband. I suggested that maybe she keep a small multimedia art book near her. Their den and dining room were connected, so why don't you take some time to write a poem instead of having to sit and listen to CSI? You'll be right here where John can see you. Over the course of several weeks, I had the honor of watching her shift from depression and resentment to excitement and self-fulfillment. She looked forward to TV time now because it afforded her new possibilities. Maybe this is what Jesus meant when he said, "The keys to the kingdom are within you." You have the key to free yourself, even if you cannot change where you're at or change your circumstances. Even if it's a slight shift in perspective, if nothing else. We're endowed with the ability to make choices that lead to greater freedom at some level. It might be a huge leap of faith that you need to take yourself toward a bigger dream that you have been holding in your heart for so long. Or it could be just that small half step toward something that your heart has wished for. May it be that every day, for you, for me, for our world, is a Juneteenth. That those of us who have been free for months but we didn't know it can set ourselves a day of Jubilee where we are free to become more of who we were created to be and what we were intended to do. And so it is. Amen.